Let's get philosophical. Critical Reflections on Conspiracy Theory. Authored by Kurtis Hagen. This is a modified portion of an article entitled, "Is Conspiracy Theorizing Really Epistemically Problematic?" published in the journal Episteme in 2020, by Kurtis Hagen. That article is a response to a set of critiques of conspiracy theorizing put forward by philosopher Keith Harris. This podcast episode focuses on just one of those critiques. Namely, Harris argues that conspiracy theorizing problematically relies on a probabilistic version of a formal argument structure known as Modus Tollens. Hagen argues that Harris's critique fails to show that there is anything epistemically problematic about conspiracy theorizing.
Is conspiracy theorizing really epistemically problematic? A response to Harris's probabilistic Modus Tollens argument. For more than 2 decades, philosophers have been debating whether or not there is something epistemically wrong with conspiracy theories. While there is some disagreement about the definition of conspiracy theory, all sides seem willing to stipulate that some conspiracy theories have turned out to be true or warranted, including Watergate and the Iran-Contra affair, for example. And thus, Keith Harris concedes that, quote, dedicated investigators may amass sufficient evidence to rationally believe certain conspiracy theories, unquote. Harris focuses on conspiracy theorizing, by which he means, quote, the belief-forming practices or reasoning processes whereby individuals come to believe conspiracy theories, unquote. Harris admits that, quote, standard criticisms of conspiracy theorizing fail to demonstrate that the practice is invariably irrational, unquote. Harris suggests that this may account for the fact that, in his words, quote, many scholars have taken a relatively charitable attitude toward conspiracy theorists and conspiracy theorizing in recent years, unquote. Presumably Harris is thinking mostly of philosophers such as David Cody, Charles Pigden, M. Dentith, and Lee Basham, perhaps even myself. In contrast to the philosophical literature, the attitude toward conspiracy theorists expressed in the social science literature has been considerably less charitable. The first half of Harris's essay is a literature review, in which he makes a number of concessions regarding the potential reasonableness of conspiracy theories. He concedes that, quote, many of the supposed faults associated with conspiracy theorizing are not faults at all, unquote. And so, quote, the faults standardly associated with conspiracy theorizing do not warrant the sort of criticism to which the practice is often subjected, unquote. More specifically, Harris considers the idea that conspiracy theorizing is a straightforward epistemic vice, concluding that
strong considerations militate against the idea that conspiracy theorists exhibit familiar epistemically vicious character traits to a greater degree than their counterparts. To see this, consider the paradigmatic conspiracy theorist who goes to great lengths to investigate the target event and amasses evidence that they take to undermine the official account of that event. Such an individual devotes a great deal of time, considerably more than non-conspiracy theorists, to uncovering the truth. Indeed, conspiracy theorists are often more knowledgeable about the circumstances surrounding target events than their counterparts, and this is plausibly a result of greater devotion to uncovering the truth, a hallmark of intellectual virtue in the responsibilist tradition.
In addition, regarding the argument against conspiracy theories based on their unfalsifiability, Harris concludes, quote, if there is an epistemic problem with conspiracy theories, and belief in them, it is not that such theories are unfalsifiable, unquote. Brian Keeley had previously suggested that, quote, unfalsifiability is only a reasonable criterion in cases where we do not have reason to believe that there are powerful agents seeking to steer our investigation away from the truth of the matter, unquote. And this does not apply in the case of conspiracy theories. Keeley argues, quote, we have reason to believe that there exist forces with both motive and capacity to carry out effective disinformation campaigns, unquote. Harris actually takes the defense of conspiracy theories on this point even further. He explains,
resilience to falsification is hardly unique to conspiracy theories. Scientific theories in general are resistant to falsification. This point is emphasized by Imre Lakatos, among others. The need to conjoin theories to auxiliary hypotheses to derive testable predictions ensures that scientific theories are not straightforwardly falsifiable.
This is refreshing. The purported unfalsifiability of conspiracy theories continues to be used against them even though falsifiability has, in the philosophy of science, been repudiated as a useful criterion for literally decades. Indeed, the theory that unfalsifiability renders theories unwarranted is itself unfalsifiable, and thus is self-refuting. Harris also addresses the suggestion, made by Steve Clark, that believing a conspiracy theory is like holding on too long to a degenerating research program. He writes,
"The criticism that conspiracy theorizing is analogous to clinging to a degenerating research program struggles on two scores. First, it is not clear that conspiracy theories, like degenerating research programs, are incapable of predicting novel facts. Second, it is not clear that the ability to predict novel facts is a reasonable criterion of goodness for a conspiracy theory."
Given all this, Harris concludes, quote, "Standard criticisms of conspiracy theorizing are misguided," unquote. At this point, Harris offers three new critiques. He argues that, 1. Conspiracy theorizing involves a kind of invalid reasoning, probabilistic modus tollens. 2. It involves a particular combination of intellectual virtues and vices which, although the vices are not unique to conspiracy theorists, in combination with the otherwise virtuous intellectual traits of conspiracy theorists, the result is epistemically problematic. And, 3. The skepticism conspiracy theorists exhibit toward authoritative sources leaves them with no basis for affirming their own theories. He summarizes his critiques this way.
"I argue that a range of epistemic errors are pervasive among conspiracy theorists. First, the refusal of conspiracy theorists to accept the official account of some target event often seems to be due to the exercise of a probabilistic and fallacious extension of modus tollens. Additionally, conspiracy theorists tend to be inconsistent in their intellectual attention insofar as the effort they expend on uncovering the truth excludes attention to their own capacities for biased or otherwise erroneous reasoning. Finally, the skepticism with which conspiracy theorists tend to view common sources of information leaves little room for conspiracy theorists to attain positive warrant for their preferred explanations of target events."
In the article from which this podcast episode is excerpted, I examine each of these critiques and find them all wanting, just as were all previous general efforts of this kind. In this podcast episode, I address only his first critique, as an example. Does conspiracy theorizing rely on probabilistic modus tollens? As mentioned above, Harris puts this critique of conspiracy theorizing as follows.
"The refusal of conspiracy theorists to accept the official account of some target event often seems to be due to the exercise of a probabilistic and fallacious extension of modus tollens."
Some of this is a bit technical, but I'll explain it before providing a response. Modus tollens is a simple, valid, argument structure that is also called denying the consequent. It refers to the following inference form: if P then Q. Not Q. Therefore not P. For example, premise 1, if you own an elephant, then you own an animal. Premise 2, you do not own an animal. Conclusion, you do not own an elephant. Given Harris's examples, it is best to add a couple extra nots, such that the Q and not Q switch, which does not actually change anything about the logical relations. It will nevertheless help to think of it this way: if P then not Q. Q. Therefore not P. So, for example, suppose it is true that, if Rex is dead then Rex's heart is not beating, if P then not Q. Suppose it is also true that, Rex's heart is beating, Q. If we can be sure of both of those statements, then we can infer, with certainty, that Rex is not dead, not P. Because if he had been dead, we had agreed in the first premise, his heart would not be beating, and yet it is. This is just logic 101, nothing controversial here. The problem that Harris raises is that this inference is not valid when dealing with probabilities, rather than certainties. Harris explains.
Modus tollens does not have a parallel legitimate probabilistic counterpart. Suppose that if P is true, it is enormously improbable that Q. Now suppose that one observes that Q. Does it follow that P is improbable? No.
In other words, the conjunction of, if P then probably not Q, and Q does not entail, probably not P. Harris gives the following example.
If any given lottery with many participants is fair, it is improbable that any particular entrant will win. However, it would be absurd to conclude, once a winner is named, that the lottery was probably unfair.
Harris is right, that would not be a valid inference. However, there are problems with Harris's critique. For one, the example Harris provides is misleading, but I will address that later. First, let's address two central problems. 1. Harris's analysis implicitly assumes, wrongly, that if evidence is not conclusive, or at least not very strong on its own, then it doesn't count as evidence at all, and 2. It is not clear that conspiracy theorizing involves the form of reasoning Harris implies. Although conspiracy theorizing may be superficially similar to probabilistic modus tollens, nuances make a difference. And, although an argument form that is not valid cannot establish its conclusion, a form of reasoning similar to it, with the proper nuance applied, may legitimately provide evidence for it. This can be seen by considering another invalid argument form, affirming the consequent, if P then Q. Q. Therefore P. A standard example is this: if it rained recently, the streets are wet. The streets are wet. Therefore, it rained recently. This is invalid, of course, because it is possible that the streets became wet some other way. Although this is clearly an invalid form, much scientific reasoning seems, superficially, to follow it. A scientist generates a hypothesis, P, then she reasons that if her hypothesis is true, she should see result Q. She then devises an experiment to produce condition P and to see if Q occurs. Of course, if Q occurs, she does not conclude that P must be true. She recognizes that that would be an invalid inference. It is possible that Q just happened to occur for some other unknown reason. However, the experiment is nevertheless evidence that her hypothesis, P, is true. And piling up evidence of this kind does legitimately increase her confidence in her hypothesis. Conspiracy theorizing using something that looks like probabilistic modus tollens is analogous. Further, the reason the conjunction of, if P then probably not Q, and Q, does not entail, probably not P, is that there are at least some instances in which we cannot draw that conclusion. But that does not mean that there are no circumstances under which we can reasonably draw that conclusion. For example, A, if Ted won the lottery he would probably not continue living in his car. B, he is still living in his car. C, therefore, he probably didn't win the lottery. It may be possible to advance some technical quibbles, but the really important point is just that the conjunction of A and B is legitimate evidence for C. And under some circumstances this kind of evidence is sufficient to reasonably support belief. To make his point about the invalidity of probabilistic modus tollens relevant to conspiracy theorizing, Harris ties it to what Brian Keeley has termed errant data, that is, data that seems unexplained by or inconsistent with the official account of an event. Harris writes,
"The observation of errant data is, I suggest, analogous to the observation that some lottery entrant has won. The observation of errant data is improbable, perhaps extremely improbable given the official account, but this alone does not provide reason to abandon the official account."
Now it's time to consider why Harris's lottery example is misleading. In his version of it, it is not surprising that there was a winner. Indeed, if the lottery is fair, someone should eventually win. And if there is a winner, it had to be somebody. So, there is really no cause for suspicion. But suppose we change the lottery story just a little, to make it resemble more closely conspiracy theorizing. Instead of some random person winning, let's assume that a close relative of someone involved in selecting the winner won. That may legitimately raise some eyebrows. But suppose it happened again and again. At some point, surely, it is reasonable to conclude that the lottery is probably unfair. And yet Harris seems to suggest that that inference is never reasonable, no matter how many times this situation is repeated. He writes,
"A set of errant data does not tell against the official account in a fundamentally different way than a single errant datum does. The observation of any single errant datum is improbable if the official account is true, while the observation of a set of errant data is even more improbable. Nonetheless, to reject the official account because it would make one's observations improbable would be a mistake in either case."
What has gone wrong? In the revised lottery example, which better represents conspiracy theorizing, it is not something simply improbable that happened. It is something suspicious that happened. It is something that suggests an alternative theory of events. Philosophers Joel Buentang and Jason Taylor label this fortuitous data, sometimes referring to it colloquially as being lucky or even fishy. They explain,
if something is lucky in the way we intend, then merely stating it will suggest an alternative explanation of that fact. Some evidence is just so lucky that it cannot be shrugged off as mere chance. The luckiness of events requires explanation.
One of the examples they offer is the following.
A passerby discovered the passport of Saddam al-Sugami, one of the alleged 9/11 hijackers. This is fortuitous. That al-Sugami's passport survived the impact, ensuing fireball, and was found 80 floors below in surprisingly pristine condition, is lucky. Moreover, that a passerby should have noticed the passport, attached significance to it, and reported the finding to an appropriate authority is fortuitous, particularly given the panic and duress one imagines those terrifying moments would have been like. All of this evidence suggests an alternative explanation, besides the explanation offered by the official story.
Whatever one thinks about the particulars of this case, one can imagine circumstances under which such a situation would suggest that al-Sugami was being set up. So, the mere fact that this is errant data does not show that it does not represent significant evidence of conspiracy. Its strength as evidence depends on the particulars. Now let's consider an example provided by Harris. The collapse of Building 7 was reported as having occurred about 26 minutes before it actually occurred, with the building actually visible still standing in the background as the reporter reports that it had collapsed. This is errant data in the sense that it seems highly improbable, if one assumes the official account is true. Nevertheless, it does not follow that the official story is probably false. Harris explains.
The report does not demonstrate that the official account is probably false. It was highly improbable, given the official account, that the reporter would assert that the tower had already collapsed, rather than that it would collapse. But only an application of probabilistic modus tollens would lead one, on this basis alone, to conclude that the official account is probably false.
It is not at all evident that there are a significant number of 9/11 conspiracy theorists who believe the official account is false on this basis alone. It is more likely they have other reasons for suspicion, and this is regarded as a striking anomaly, suggestive in that context of suspicious foreknowledge. So, the suggestion that conspiracy theorizing involves concluding the official story is probably false, on this basis alone, is a bit of a red herring. Further, whether or not this situation is reasonably regarded as suspicious depends, once again, on the particulars of the situation. Were there good reasons to expect Building 7 would fail, and thus reasonable explanations for how a report of its potential collapse may have innocently been converted to a mistaken report of its actual collapse shortly before it happened? If so, that is the reason this is not strong evidence against the official account. In general, it is just such particulars that will determine whether and to what degree errant data provide evidence against an official account. Also, we must remember that the important question is not whether a situation such as the premature report of the collapse of Building 7 shows that the official account is probably false, it is whether such an example provides any evidence at all. Is it completely irrelevant? Can it be that, no matter how numerous and outlandish the errant data, we would never be justified in believing, based on this kind of evidence, that the account relative to which such data was errant was wrong. It is not too difficult to recognize that that just can't be right. Let's briefly consider a couple more real-life examples for clarity and emphasis. A prominent argument cited by members of the 9/11 Truth movement is that various lines of evidence suggest that there were significant quantities of molten steel, or iron, present at the WTC sites around the time of the collapse and after. When NIST Representative John Gross was asked about reports of pools of molten steel at the WTC sites, he seemed to implicitly admit that, if true, this would constitute a problem. He responded, with a clearly dismissive air, suggesting that the reports are not true.
Steel melts at around 2,600 degrees Fahrenheit. I think it's probably pretty difficult to get that kind of temperatures in a fire.
This suggests that if the claims of molten steel or iron held up, they would constitute significant evidence, though still not proof. What is important is whether or not such claims do hold up, not whether they count as, merely, errant data. Now consider some facts regarding the Robert Kennedy assassination. While the witnesses placed Sirhan's gun about 3 feet away, the coroner determined that Kennedy was shot from about 1 to 3 inches away, toward the back of the head, behind the right ear. Surely that is evidence of Sirhan's innocence, with regard to firing the fatal shot. It is not by itself proof, of course. It is not necessarily even sufficient evidence to make it probable that the official account is wrong. But it is evidence nonetheless. That is, it gives us a reason to increase our assessment of the likelihood that the official account is wrong. Whether or not one is warranted in believing the official account is wrong, or that it is probably wrong, depends on the sum total of evidence, including this kind of evidence. There are also less directly relevant instances of errant data, which are less telling, but not necessarily without significance. In the case of the Robert Kennedy assassination, for example, Sirhan's lawyer, Grant Cooper, was under pending indictment at the time he was, some say incompetently, defending Sirhan. Though Cooper was potentially facing jail time for possession of stolen grand jury transcripts, he eventually got off with merely a fine. Are circumstances that suggest Cooper may easily have been pressured to throw his client under the bus, combined with reasons to think that he did just that, epistemically irrelevant? No, even if this could never by itself justify rejecting the official story, its degree of significance depends on the details and further context. However inconvenient, that is what has to be carefully considered. Let's look at one last example of errant data, statements by doctors and others at Parkland Hospital after the attempt to save President Kennedy's life. Many of these statements seem to suggest that the president was shot from the front. These statements, which are errant relative to the official story, do constitute evidence that Oswald was not the lone gunman. They are not, by themselves, conclusive, of course. They do not even show, by themselves, that Oswald was probably not the lone gunman. After all, many reasons have been given to explain away these statements. I'm not trying to adjudicate the strength of this evidence or the plausibility of the responses to it. But I am asserting that such adjudication, taking into account all the relevant evidence, is precisely what is necessary to determine whether or not the lone gunman theory is the best one. Simply making a point about probabilistic modus tollens just isn't going to do it. In fact, it does not help at all. Indeed, it is positively misleading. For it wrongly suggests that data that seems to problematize an official account cannot be relevant. But surely it can be. And thus, in any given case, we ought to evaluate the degree to which the evidence is relevant and how much weight it should be given. And we should adjust our assessments accordingly. In some cases, this might even involve coming to believe a conspiracy theory.
You have been listening to a modified portion of an article entitled "Is Conspiracy Theorizing Really Epistemically Problematic?" published in the journal Episteme in 2020, by Kurtis Hagen.